Good afternoon. I'm here today with Nick, and we are here on behalf of Saolta, which is the Adult and Community Education Consortium for Global Citizenship Education. And we are here to talk about our baseline report that we worked on last year, and we had an event in April as a launch event, which we were really happy to see a lot of the IDEA members and Saolta Consortium members there too. Yeah, essentially today, just going to share with you the sort of overriding findings from the research, so that we'll go through the summary brief, look a little bit at the facts and figures around that, and maybe try and contextualize that a little bit in what we can be doing as a sector, and what sort of work might be some more supporting for global citizenship education in the further education, in the adult and community education sector. As I mentioned, Saolta, we are working in the GCE space for the adult and community education sector. We are funded by Irish Aid. We're a consortium of 5 member groups. So we have Concern Worldwide, AINTIS, Irish Rural Link, and Maynooth University, the Department for Adult and Community Education. And we also are with Development Perspectives, who are the lead partner in the consortium. So the report itself, we have the most up-to-date figures to end of 2022. We had the event launch in April 23, and that consists of, well, a lot of the information came from 2 mapping reports that were conducted over 2020 and 2022. How that data collection was facilitated, let's say, was through phone calls, emails, survey responses filled out online, and during telephone interviews too. So there was a lot of work and hours put in to reach out to organizations who might have, in any capacity of in the adult and community education sector, conducted some global citizenship education workshops, courses, adult education modules that might have incorporated GCE in some way. So it's very, very broad in a sense of all the different types of information we've collected. So we've already used, I already mentioned that we have the 2 mapping reports as a base for a lot of the data collection. We also then had sectoral data that we collected through Solace, the ETB, and other organizations, other organizations and such. A collection of survey data across different participants from the workshops that we've conducted. We also use Saolta data, so looking at things like location, number of participants, different types of organizations, also working from primary sources, so things that we collected from the organizations themselves, either from their websites or different materials and publications that they have, and then contextualizing a lot of the European figures through Eurostat. I won't be going through everything that's in the report today because there was just a lot, so I really do encourage you to go have a look at the report here. But before I go into that, I'm going to pass you on over to Nick, who's just going to share a little bit on, just framing a little bit the information I'm going to share.
Yeah, thanks a million, Sarah. So just a very quick introduction of myself. I'm Nick Doran. I'm the program manager for Saolta, which Sarah had outlined there a minute or two ago. I'm just going to go through some of the caveats and limitations, but I'm not going to spend very long on this, because it's really just, I suppose, some of the challenges that were found when trying to pull together the data sets for the research. And I don't want to labor the points too long, because I mean there was so much positive information and data and conclusions and outcomes from the research. But these were just some of the challenges, I suppose, that we faced during this. So the first one was inconsistencies in the availability of data across ACE subsectors. So this really just points to like the enormous diversity and range of different educational fields within adult and community education. So particularly in statutory providers, and well, not particularly in statutory providers, but within statutory providers, even though there is a certain level of formalism to how they carry out their adult and community education inputs, it's still vast. It's such a huge and vast network across all of the ETBs across Ireland, all of the further education institutes within those ETBs, and then even within ETBI, the overarching kind of umbrella organization that looks after the ETBs. There's just it's quite a huge network of organizations that carry out their responsibilities in a range of different ways. So this was one of the problems that was faced, and this was also the case, and maybe more so within non-statutory providers, so adult and community education organizations across the country that engage in on some level in global citizenship education, but the gathering of the data, which I'll kind of put focus on in a second, was difficult just in relation to what the nature of the ACE organizations do, what type of education they provide, where they provide it, and what their focus is specifically. So next slide, please, Sarah. So this kind of there's a kind of a common thread going through each of these different caveats and limitations that I'm highlighting. But so the diverse and often ambiguous nature of global citizenship education and global citizenship education related activities. So an awful lot of providers of global citizenship education, both in statutory organizations and in non-statutory organizations, they might be providing something that is without doubt part of what global citizenship education is, but they might not necessarily define it themselves as global citizenship education. So they could be giving contexts around environment, or they could be giving elements of racial justice and inequality and tackling of poverty and various different issues. But sometimes it's not necessarily defined as global citizenship education, and quite often people aren't necessarily fully aware that global citizenship education is a kind of an all-encompassing whole that can be used to define what it is that they're doing. And this gets into then definitions. So even within global citizenship, or GCE, there's education for sustainable development is another kind of iteration of a similar field of action, and then also development education, and then as GENE, or the Global Education Network in Europe, has defined it, just global education, which they try to use as a term that encompasses GCE, ECD, and DE. And from my research, the findings that I've come across is that the difference between the three is not really anything substantial. So different people define it in different ways, but ultimately the goal of each of these three, well, development education is a kind of an old term, I suppose, a legacy term for global citizenship education. But between ESD and GCE, the overlap is so vast that it's not really the gap is not big enough to really be something that is worthy of a definitional difference. So definitions as well as people's understanding of it. Next slide, please, Sarah. So then also the wide-ranging gaps in the availability of GCE specific data collection. So GCE is not necessarily recorded, and this feeds back into maybe organizations still not having a coherent understanding of what GCE necessarily is, or maybe providing some elements of GCE, but not understanding that they are providing those elements of GCE. So like within further education and training institutes, for example, again, they could be providing quite a lot of context within their courses, be it social care or maths or literacy or whatever it is. They could be providing quite a lot of context around like inequality, social justice, racial justice, but they wouldn't necessarily define it as GCE. And then by virtue of that, they might not necessarily feel that it's something that needed to be recorded. And this goes back again to the previous caveat around just the size, scale of the ACE sector. So then, complexity and levels of embedding approaches. Again, this is really around how often, if GCE exists within the ACE sector, be it further education and training or in the broader ACE sector, quite often it is just people who take it on themselves to explain or embed elements of GCE within their practice, but not necessarily define it as such. So these all kind of combined to make it a little tricky to gather the data, because the data is not necessarily consistent across the board, and the data is different between FET and the broader ACE sector. And then also there's not kind of one unified approach to data gathering within those two different sectors. But, and this is the last thing I wanted to say as well. So in a recent conversation, and this kind of was important in relation to this, and sorry, I won't take too much more of your time, Sarah. It came to light that I think it's important that we don't necessarily try to make the ACE and GCE overlapping sectors to shape them in a way that we can gather very distinct data, just by virtue of the risk of potentially homogenizing GCE inputs. And I think that that's one of the strengths of global citizenship education, is that people do have different approaches, different ways of delivering and embedding global citizenship education. And it's important to understand all of those, but trying to put together a research program to gather such a diverse sector is does not come without its difficulties, for sure. But nonetheless, we've taken a pretty decent attempt at it, and Sarah is going to go through now some of the some of the outcomes and of the report. Thanks, Bernard.
Great, thanks, Nick. Yeah, never of caveats and challenges sounded so positive, I think. Great. So kind of coming back to the report and what we were able to kind of derive from the data collection. So looking at global citizenship education providers and learners was important for the baseline, because what we wanted to look at was the strength of the sector, or more so a reflection of some of the work that's occurring in the sector, and again some of the challenges that come with trying to label something as GCE, and what can be done to kind of to overcome some of the mysteries of that and kind of share what GCE is. So yeah, by looking at providers and learners, we felt like that was a good way of getting a scope of the sector and the impact. We broke it down into the local and national NGOs. ETB, so Education Training Board sponsored adult and community education. Then we have non-ETB based community education work, looking at community development or community development work, so more with the community development companies and such. Local authorities and PPNs were also a very important factor within looking at GCE provision, and then again overall learner participation. What I found really interesting when looking at these figures, especially around learner participation, is knowing how many, well, an approximation of how many adults are taking part in learning programs. So in 2021, from the ages 25 to 26, there was over 343,000 adults who partook in a Solace funded learning program. And almost nearly half of those, so 142,000, participated in formal learning, and then 225,000 took part in non-formal learning. So I think that's really interesting to kind of see one kind of set of numbers around learner participation. If you look at the ETBs, it's actually, I think, 148,000 learning participants there. So kind of looking at this in context then, from those 148,000 learners, of those learners from which we received survey data back from the ETBs, was that there was, oh, excuse me, I've skipped ahead. So there was 1,478 learners that engaged in GCE in community and development work. And within those networks, 31 members of staff had specific global citizenship educated related responsibilities. And that was coming from 5 groups, organizations that responded to the survey. So in a sense, that's actually a very healthy number of people knowing how GCE actually is related to their work, and how then can see that that will be incorporated in the types of um, learning experiences that they provide or give an opportunity for people to partake in. Looking at the further education training through the ETB providers, I think this was two ETBs that had responded on this one specifically, and they had 220 learners that engaged in GCE activities. So there was a high level of willingness again within the network of ETBs working with external people for their GCE related activities. There were over 3,000 learners who engaged in GCE with non-ETB community education providers. So there was 5 respondents in this cohort, and 10 of these staff, 10 had specific staff members to um, who had specific GCE related responsibilities. So we had 220 learners in ETBs that had engaged with GCE, and you can see then engaged in FET, community education, NGOs. Overall, there was 14,549 learners, so across the 4 different subsectors that I mentioned earlier. What we also noticed was that, and this is skewed in a way because of the number of respondents, and respondents being generally heavily more skewed towards the NGO sector. So this geographical reach comes with a caveat again, that dependent on where the location of the NGOs, predominantly a lot of them are centered in Dublin, so they look like they have the highest provision of GCE, which makes sense, obviously, as the capital, but it mightn't be necessarily completely representative of the wider range of the work. But what we can see is that there is less activity happening in the Midlands and the Southwest. So the majority of GCE providers are located in urban centres. We've got Dublin with 32%, Cork 10%, Galway 7%, 46% of NGOs operate across local and county-wide level, 29% operate nationally, and 13% operate at a European and international level. So I think that's got a nice spread across NGOs who are engaging in GCE work here in Ireland, and obviously they're contextualized in the community, but also up to 13% of them are looking at international cooperation. So this is a breakdown of the number of estimated learners by subsectors. So here on the left-hand side, with nearly 7,500 learners engaged through NGOs, through a wide spread of different types of activities. And I'll go into that in a minute. Then the next level of respondents we had was for community education. So that was the non-ETB accredited program providers. Then it looks at the further education training and further education colleges. So just over 2,200 participants for that. Adult education. So again, you can see there's a big contrast between adult education as responded by the ETBs, or how the further education colleges or institutes were still able to directly respond to us. So we can see that there's a little bit of a difference in communication, or what information is being collected, I think maybe is probably a better way of understanding why ETBs look like there's such low participation, when ETBs are overseeing or overriding in the umbrella of further education institutes. So yeah, I suppose kind of looking at it more locally, in the sense that centres or colleges themselves have a much stronger awareness of GCE related activities than they are reporting to, say, ETB, and that might be things because of what is being asked to be reported on. So can there be an opportunity for stakeholders, for sectoral leaders, gatekeepers in a sense, of all this information, to be looking at ways of understanding in which ways GCE is happening, because they're actually asking for that data to be collected. And then lastly, community educations, which are funded through ETB. And again, that would be more determined on the number of responses rather than the actual level of activity that's happening, because we know anecdotally and that there is so much activities happening all across Ireland. So moving over onto the right-hand side of the slide, we're going to look at the estimated numbers of learners based by activity type. And this is really interesting because I think, yeah, if you look at the figures for number of learners, NGOs have the highest level of learners by, by a factor of 2. So what kind of activities are they kind of generating? And yes, it would be more around public events and workshops. Then after those two ones at the top, the non-accredited and accredited courses generally provided through the ETBs. Now they're interesting because what it shows is that people are more able to engage with the shorter, kind of less time time promised or time consuming events, or occasions. So accredited courses, non-accredited courses, um, they might be available to people who have more time. Public events and workshops, they seem to be a really great way of disseminating information, getting more people involved. And more often than not, what we also know is that people who are coming into searching for accredited courses or non-accredited courses, they will generally have participated in earlier events too. So if it is that they're gaining access or knowing more about GCE through the NGOs and then going into the adult community education sector to pursue some of those interests more, I'd like to kind of highlight that as an opportunity too for just to kind of increase people's understanding and awareness of GCE and supporting them into further education, green skills, and developing that information further. Okay, great. So like I mentioned, there are gaps in the Southwest and in the Midlands, more so got to do with data collection rather than, or data responses rather than that it's not happening. We're very, very aware that there are some really fantastic groups happening and operating in these areas. Again, but they're also generally coming from a voluntary basis. So, being mindful about the levels of research and input is something that has to be understood in the context of the ACE sector. And we can see that there's a real urban and rural provision difference within that too. Okay, great. So these are kind of the last 5 points of the report I wanted to bring up to you. So like I mentioned, over 7,000 people have partaken in NGO workshops. So NGOs generally will have a higher staff capacity that are looking at GCE. So out of the 28 NGOs that were surveyed, so there are over 104 NGOs operating in Ireland that would deal with a global citizenship education context. Out of those ones, 28 had responded, and though out of those 28, there was 55 staff members that had specific responsibility for GCE activity. So that suggests that organizations with expertise within the sector, they use that expertise to educate, support, and partner with other institutes and centres. And I'm going to get onto partnership in a minute. Out of the local authorities and through PBNs, this is a really fantastic number, is 597 participants that were engaged through Saolta's training over the last few years. We've engaged with 15 out of 31 PPNs as of last year. I think that we've added another 3 or 4 onto that coming this year, maybe 5. So that again, I think is a really good reflection on the partnerships that we're trying to create with PPNs going forward and kind of trying to introduce GCE in the context of so many new policy provisions and different plans that are coming in. So the GCE element of like engaging with community groups and local elected members and staff is so important because there's a lot of context that needs to be shared around global citizenship education, structural inequalities, the impacts of globalization and localization and climate action, things like that. So another aspect of the report looked at a little bit outside of adult and community education in the sense that it was looking at higher education institutes' provision into providing initial teacher education, and initial teacher education specifically for practitioners going to be working into the in the adult and community education sector. So that's one part of Saolta's work now, is working on doing a global citizenship education introductions to the initial teacher education students, so that they're having a really great basis and foundation for GCE when they're going through their student journey and then moving into the classrooms. So this is a breakdown of the participation per activity type. So nearly 7,000 people participated through workshops, 2,700 in public events, seminars, welcomed in 1,440 participants, and then between the accredited and non-accredited courses, it's nearly 4,000 participants, 3.5, I think. And yeah, you can see that accredited courses are generally not taken up as much as non-accredited ones, and that kind of might be due to time, or different learning outcomes or providers. So through Saolta's programming as well, we've had over 1,042 practitioners and stakeholders that have participated in our workshops over the last 3 years since the program has been running. So these practitioners have included for people from the local government, NGOs, HEIs, further education institutes, community groups, and facilitated with people that are within Saolta, but also in collaboration with other organizations too, both locally and internationally. So talking about partnerships, here we can see that there are, I think I've got another slide here as well that might be a little bit clearer to see, but this is the whole portion of partnerships that are happening in global citizenship education as we understand it at the moment. So it's generally quite evened out between the NGOs, ETBs, local development, local community development opportunities, and then this one here I think is quite interesting, is that the highest proportion of people that have been collaborated with are individual trainers and facilitators, consultants. So perhaps IDEA members themselves, and I think the way that the way the database works for membership is that they can centers can learn about different people who might be able to provide workshops that are more specific to their needs or their understanding of different elements within the courses. So that's a really positive thing to see, because those individuals, trainers, facilitators, and consultants are feeding into all the other spaces in which GCE is happening. So here, again, number of partnerships, organizations. So individual trainers were finding that they were working with over 50 people. Other NGOs were working with over 40 different organizations. ETBs, local community development work, PPN have 35 different organizations they've worked with. Yeah, and you can see that, the trend kind of flows downwards, but it's really, I think that's where it's really interesting to see the level of workshops that are happening with the NGOs and individual participants, individual facilitators, because that is really what's feeding into a lot of the different sectors. And we can see it when we go to either IDEA membership workshops or different workshops. There is a lot of like cross-pollination that's happening across the member organizations in IDEA. So that just to me shows a really good cohesiveness of the topics that we're looking at. But I also think that there should be recognition that we should be expanding our sector in terms of like who's involved, who's getting included, what kind of voices do we need to draw in from internationally too. That's not in the report, but that's just a thought that I've had over the last few months, kind of reflecting after the report too. So coming into future considerations, looking at the kind of the two elements of global citizenship integration into the whole into the sector, and then into the whole of sector of the adult and community education sector, and then looking deeper into specific centres. And part of that would also be improving participant research or research participation. So the way that we in Saolta have been looking at this would be looking at from, well, how to get more robust and quality data from our research is in part being able to ensure that practitioners, participants, centres, the sector itself has a better grasp of what global citizenship education is. I know that everyone here on this call, that's a big part of it too, would be the capacity building for the members that they're engaging with. So capacity building for tutors, administrators, and centre management is really important to contextualise what is GCE and how it might be happening in your locations. Um, Making more robust the networks between global citizenship practitioners and those who are looking to explore it. So creating more opportunities for sharing and learning about GCE. It doesn't matter dependent on your level of knowledge, but there's going to be that cross sharing. So creating communities of practice around global citizenship education. And lastly, a framework for global citizenship education integration into further education institutes. So Saolta, we have produced a lot of research around how to embed GCE into different elements, so further education institutes through QQI modules, or how to integrate that through the local authorities or through PPNs. But if we're looking specifically at a further education institute, looking at things like an award, so that the further education institutes almost have a framework themselves of understanding like what would quality GCE look like in my centre, and how would it work across the centre too, depending on the different types of courses that we provide. So those are things that we're working on in future to see if we can, you know, engage, because we're doing training of trainers, we're providing a lot of different courses around global citizenship education, so basically equipping people with the knowledge around GCE, and the awards level would kind of help to put that into practice a little bit more, so almost like a self-assessment tool, and then providing that network of communities of practice to help support educators, to provide better quality and effective global citizenship education. So a part of the workshop that we had on in April was that we wanted to push this information back and kind of gain some insights from the people that were in the room on the day. And what we did was we asked who in your own organizations might be best placed to answer questions around global citizenship education, having a self-assessment on what they believe would be the kind of awareness of GCE in your org. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations might have people that are directly responsible for GCE. Is that something that just happens within one officer, or is that something kind of that trickles across the organization because you have an officer? So it was an interesting kind of question to explore. And what role in your organization is best suited to respond to research questions? So, you know, when these opportunities come up to participate, are they reaching the right person? Is probably one of the bigger kind of fundamental questions of these sort of surveys. And then we asked, what approaches do we suggest to would be best suited to receive high responses on surveys and research participation? And there were some really great bits of information that came out of that. So I'm just going to share them quickly. So it was broken down into identify. So the group there suggested that they go through the website and look at the workshops and courses that are provided to spot the ones that are GCE relevant. So like Nick mentioned, not necessarily even going for just the one label of GCE, but education for sustainable development, development education, global education. How is it understood, and maybe taking some notes around that. So, trying to shift the language that makes it more kind of digestible to maybe the organization, meet them where they are, if that's of help. Contact or maybe target local organizations through their local networks, either so through the councils, through the PPNs. You might have like a food distribution hub or a community growing network. See what networks then that, like, how would they share that information throughout their organizations too and their network. This was one that I thought was interesting too, was like search for known and seek out the unknown networks. So never sort of assume that you've reached everybody. Um, so maybe there could be new avenues, and new avenues would absolutely be dependent on you asking and trying to get more outreach maybe from the other contacts that you have. So yeah. Contact. So in the process of contacting then the organizations, so yeah, explain why this research is important and what respondents are contributing to. People are giving and using their time. Networking and use of personal touch. There's a suggestion that a TV ad could be put up so to raise awareness about global citizenship education is, and to give some support for how to go through the survey, and maybe using things like a simpler language, make it relatable, use practical examples and everyday language. So not doing so, it can make them feel incompetent. I think that was one big part too, was that depending on who you're speaking to in a community group or something like that, if they feel like they're not, don't feel like it's relevant to them, then maybe they won't answer. So really thinking about how to sort of frame language in a way that encourages and doesn't scare them away. Being clear in how we communicate, acknowledges some of the challenges that they might have. You might have to ask again and again. Your previous contacts mightn't be working there anymore. And afterwards is really important to share the feedback and the reason why this research is happening, and the benefits of getting responses like that. And two things to remember are that NGOs are run by volunteers or paid staff. So you might have different levels of possibilities of getting feedback, and knowing that there will not be 100% survey responses. So being clear, like at what stage, what are your kind of cutoff points, and how are you going to reach that goal for your, yeah, to ensure you got quality research.